This video was made possible with the support of our Patreon members. Welcome to the 61st episode of the Psychology Is podcast. I am your host, Nick Fortino, and today I have with me Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring. I have become aware of your work online. You're active on the X platform. You have a YouTube channel, and so you have a strong online presence, and you're doing amazing work. So thank you very much for joining me this morning, Dr. Josef.
Nick, it's a pleasure to be here. And, as I mentioned before, I've been watching your show for several years as well. And so it's, I love your content, and I'm excited to have a chat with you.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So as people may know, you are a board certified psychiatrist, and my understanding is that your practice has evolved in such a way that now you have this specialization of identifying and treating people with adverse reactions to prescription psychiatric drugs. And I think there's this growing awareness, obviously in certain communities especially, but I think even more generally, this growing awareness that there are adverse effects of prescribed psychiatric drugs, and that sometimes those are extreme and perhaps for some people even worse than the original condition that they were attempting to treat. So I want to get deep into that, kind of the evolution of your thinking, what led you to develop this specialization. But first, maybe just a bit about your background. So can you just describe for us, your process of deciding to become a psychiatrist, what your psychiatric training was like, and what the early days of your psychiatric practice was like?
Sure. Yeah. So my process of becoming a psychiatrist was, I have always been interested in psychology and philosophy. I just liked reading it from a young age. It was something that my father instilled within me. He liked that, and I liked it as well. I ended up going to medical school, kind of lost, not really knowing which direction I wanted to go specialty-wise, maybe surgery, maybe internal medicine. But then psychiatry appeared as a way that I could combine my interest in psychology, philosophy, all of those things with medicine. And so, being very interested in that, from a personal place, but also just intellectually, I love the idea of learning, what do humans need to do well in relationships and within their lives, and to find fulfillment. And obviously there's a lot of personal interest with that as well. And when I got into my psychiatric training, I was shocked. And I was shocked mostly because I guess my expectation going into it was that, a lot of the mental health problems that people would be having are probably understandable, based in hardship of life. And sure, there could be genetic or biological illnesses out there as well. But, it'd be a fraction of what we'd be treating. And mostly we would be helping people in a more holistic way, trying to really improve their lives. That was not what I saw in psychiatry when I entered. In fact, it was, we would only... We didn't even spend enough time with people to understand their lives, was the first thing that I noticed. You could have, a 45-minute intake with someone, and then you see them for like 15 minutes every, 2 months or something like that. It's simply not enough time to truly understand the problems that people were having. And we would be expected to treat them based on this very limited interaction with them, and treat them mostly with medications. There were hardly any services. There were, you could meet with a psychologist or a social worker. Typically it was like, once a month for, 45 minutes. And so to me, fairly early on in my training, something felt off. And I was just like, we're not really getting to know our patients. We're not really understanding the problems going on in their lives, and we're treating them with these medications, all under the guise of, maybe they have some mysterious mental illness. This chronic, mysterious, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and and we've got these treatments for it. And so that felt intuitively off to me, because I'm more of a, understand the problem, and then once you understand the problem, you can fix it. It just makes sense. We weren't doing that. And then I started to notice that it just didn't work. And rarely did I put someone on a psychiatric medication and they were just fine. It was just like sail off into the sunset, no more symptoms, and they're okay. In fact, a lot of the times, many of them, they developed tolerance, sometimes within 3 to 6 months, and we had to keep on going up on the dose. Eventually, they would be maxed out on the dose, and we'd have to add another drug, and so on and so forth, until we had someone on 5 drugs and, really not doing well. And so, and eventually you would hit this dead end, and I would find myself scratching my head going, well, we've got this guy essentially, on 5 different drugs, really flat, really not getting any better. And instead of really questioning, maybe this isn't working, or maybe these drugs were never meant to be prescribed in these multi-cocktails. Maybe the drugs are the problem. We wouldn't do that. We, would send people to go and get ECT, and they just got so sick, and some of them never got better. And the other thing that was really bothering me during this time was that we kept on telling patients that these drugs were easy to come off, and that the withdrawal was mild and self-limiting. And at the same time, all of this is going on, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing that these drugs are incredibly difficult to stop, and that also, my colleagues are misdiagnosing withdrawal as new mental illnesses. And so I started feeling like I was going crazy, because no one seemed to be talking about the fact that there were so many people that this system was not working for at all. In fact, I dare say probably the majority of people, I would see, more than 50% would eventually run into these types of problems. And I just felt like I was going insane. Is no one else seeing this? Is no one else talking about, the fact that these drugs simply stop working long-term in a big group of people, and then they're really hard to come off? And so that was the sort of the genesis of the practice, was that, wow, there's a huge number of people out there who have been put on these medications. They're not helping them. They're kind of trapped on them. When they try and come off, they're having horrific problems. And we don't have a workforce that's really trained to help them. And so that's the problem that I set out to solve. And that's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
As you were having these observations, and it was so alarming to you, were you raising these questions to supervisors, colleagues, fellow psychiatrists, and what were their responses?
I'll talk about the supervisors, and this was mainly in residency. I felt like I was just annoying them, and that it's like, I got the feeling like this is the way, that it's almost, I think, to practice in that way where you diagnose patients just off symptom checklists and then give them drugs according to, FDA labels to me, it's like you really drink the kool-aid, and the kool-aid you need to consume is that mental illness is chronic and poorly understood, and there's not much you can do about it, especially with the depression and anxiety. And so when I was having questions like, maybe the drug's making them worse, maybe we're simply not fixing the problems in their lives because we don't understand them, it would be kind of parried away or waved away, depression, chronic, scary mental illness, and really all these other things that you're worried about, the side effects, they're not that common. These drugs are safe and well tolerated, problems in their life, surely they're not to the degree that they could cause this type of suffering. And so I felt that there was this huge biological culture where I trained, and I think it's mostly everywhere in the US, where most kind of psychiatrists, mainstream psychiatrists, tend to view things as very biological and just kind of coming up out of someone's genes. And so when I was bringing it up, I was just making things complicated. We have a model, it works, we're practicing according to the guidelines, and here's someone making things difficult, and I've got 20 patients to see today, and this is how I do things, and don't make my job any more difficult. Could you just be a team player and just kind of go along with things because I've got stuff to do? That was
Right.
That was the general feeling that I got.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then at what point did you decide to start a private practice and turn your attention to helping people who are kind of addicted to these drugs?
It was a long, good process. I think I wanted to do it for some time, but I was also someone that was kind of caught up in maybe not wanting to leave mainstream psychiatry and trying to find a place within there. Because after I left residency, I was just like, well, I like safety, and maybe I like drug side effects. Maybe I'll go work in a pharmaceutical company. And so I did that, and then I went and worked at the FDA and did that for a while. And each time that I went to these places trying to get a new perspective on, how we were investigating the safety of the drugs and then informing doctors about them so they could make, good decisions for their patients. More of the same came up, which was that, I don't know, there's just on all levels, even in the FDA and the pharmaceutical company, obviously, I felt like there was a strong desire to not really say negative things about the drugs. And I wonder if that has something to do with maybe the psyche of psychiatrists, and that we are, as a medical specialty, some people think it's not really like a legitimate specialty. So maybe there's almost like a defensiveness about the drugs and the interventions, because it is a specialty that I think people look down on because it has less objective, diagnoses and signs and things like that. And so I often felt that people were kind of not really wanting to talk a lot about the problems with these meds and bury them. And that just ate away at me. And so after being in industry for about 2 years all up, and then the FDA for 1 year, I can't do this anymore. I need to go and find some way where I can practice in alignment with my beliefs. And that's when I quit everything and went full-time into the practice that had been going on for a couple of years at that time, and really said, this is my vehicle for life. This is what I'm going to build my career around. And gosh, that was in May of last year that I did that. Okay. So still pretty fresh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up your experience at the FDA. I really wanted to ask you about that. So, I think for many people, who have a sort of typical experience of experiencing this form of suffering and then seeking professional help, as everyone suggests you should do, and meeting with a psychiatrist that is paid for through their insurance company at a hospital, and then being diagnosed with a condition and prescribed a drug. I think part of the reason that they have no hesitation to adhere to that protocol is because it's FDA approved. That stamp of approval, I think, in the minds of most Americans is very legitimizing and assuring that this is not going to be harmful. It's FDA approved. And so can you talk to us about exactly what you just kind of alluded to, that there actually, is bias within the FDA, and so maybe like the process of approving of these drugs and what the shortcomings are in that process?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think the main thing that people need to realize about psychiatric medications is they're studied for literally 3 months for their approval, which is, just let that sink in for a second. And these are drugs that potentially a fifth of the adult population in the US are taking on a daily basis. Most of them are studied for 3 months or less in clinical trials. And so if you're going to take it for 3 months or less, you could feel pretty darn safe about doing it. FDA has looked at it. They've done placebo-controlled trials. The safety data is pretty good. The problems that I see are that these drugs are not taken for 3 months. In fact, they're taken for several years. There's a median duration of use of antidepressants for 2 years when someone takes them long term. And And so I think that's the first problem there, is that we hear, approved by the FDA, safe and effective, but the part that they leave out is for the 3 months that they were studied.
Right.
And then there's this question, which is like, well, why doesn't the FDA make people study them for 2 to 3 years if that's how long they're using them for? And there's no real answer for that apart from they just haven't done it, because precedent was set way back when that it was okay to approve them with a 3-month trial. And once they do that with one drug, unless there's huge public outcry or people want to change that, all of the other drug companies do it in the same way. Statins, these cholesterol drugs, we make drug companies study them for 5 years in placebo-controlled trials. It's a huge amount of time, but it makes sense for a long-use drug. I think it's 3 to 5 years for those. And so we're just not doing that with psychiatric drugs. So the main thing I would just say is, safe and effective for 3 months, and then it starts to become a question mark. The other thing is, so after that time, all safety issues with the drugs are managed kind of in this like sort of post-marketing review, where you're looking at essentially reports that are sent into the agency. So after the clinical trial is done, the drug's on the market, the FDA learns about safety issues from reports coming in from patients. And what I saw at the FDA was that there was very little review of these cases coming in, which is a shame because people are writing them in good faith and sending them in. And usually what happens to them is, someone reads them, there's not enough information in there, and they just say, let's say someone took a drug and became suicidal. They'll say, well, not enough information, unable to determine if due to the underlying condition. And the agency simply is not resourced enough or does not have the willpower or desire to actually follow up on the cases that are coming in to say, well, can we have more information? Can we talk to someone in your family? Did this acute worsening in suicidal behavior occur in the context of a stressor in your life? Really to dig into each one of these reports. I never saw that at the FDA. I didn't see a single officer ever reach out to someone who had submitted a report to gain further clarity. A lot of it was just kind of not enough information, kind of moving on. And I mean, this is another thing that's kind of interesting. FDA is mostly funded by the pharmaceutical industry. I think people don't realize that it's about 70% funded. And because of that, there's a lot of these, I guess, requirements of the FDA. So when pharma submits a packet to get a drug onto the market, they have 9 months to review that, and that's how they get the funding. We're going to send you something, you have to do it in 9 months. And because of that, most of the division's resources go into doing these reviews to get drugs onto the market, and there's not a lot of time spent looking at post-marketing safety issues. And that's why we have problems right now with PSSD. Essentially, it's been ignored by the FDA for 6 years since the Citizens Petition came in, which is absolutely disgusting considering that they respond to pharmaceutical companies bringing new drugs onto the market in 9 months. And when someone puts in a petition about a serious adverse reaction, you just let it sit there for 6 years. They're getting sued by Public Citizen at the moment for that, thank God. And you also have issues like protracted withdrawal, which aren't really recognized. So all of these serious, kind of more uncommon, maybe more rare, you would say, serious adverse reactions, they're just missed because the agency isn't really resourced to look into them. And I also think, there's simply a defensiveness. Because in the FDA psychiatrists as well, there is a defensiveness about psychiatric meds, even within the groups that are supposed to be objective about them.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot that you just said that people should let really sink in. I think this might be a section of the podcast worth rewinding and listening to again, because it's just, how do we get here? How do we get here? This is such a serious problem. And to witness it play out too in real life, so to speak, I witness it in individuals that I work with. I witness it in what students share with me as in my role as a college professor. And above all, I witnessed this in the jails. I work in the jail system. I get to know many people very well who are doing time, and their experiences working with psychiatrists within the jail, it's infuriating, honestly. That's the emotion I am now feeling the most. It's just infuriating how poorly understood these individuals are by the psychiatrists who are prescribing them these drugs. And then, as so many people know so well, and as you described earlier, it's just so common to continuously increase the dose as the person's tolerance is increasing, and to add other drugs into the mix, which of course it's already, in my opinion, completely unacceptable the way the FDA approves of these drugs in the first place. But like the way I think of it often is the discrepancy between evidence and practice is so extreme at this point. It's so extreme because not only is there a discrepancy between the safety trials, the duration of the safety trials and the duration of how long people take these drugs in real life, but there's the discrepancy between the, you know, the way that the FDA will study a drug on its own singularly, but then the way that it's so common to prescribe multiple drugs all at the same time for very long durations of time at ever increasing doses. It's just that's people are the experiments, but they think that there are experiments already done showing that what they're being prescribed is already safe and effective.
Yeah.
So it's such an extreme problem.
It's crazy.
And it's crazy.
I'm going to say some inflammatory stuff because I work for myself now. But I do feel like there are some corollaries between the kind of, what we see in these prison systems and things that used to happen in Nazi Germany, because there is a willful blindness to what's going on. There's a sense of I'm just following orders, and it's very easy for me to just say, okay, this person is getting worse on these drugs, instead of being like, maybe it's a side effect. I need to spend more time digging into it. Maybe they're on a cocktail of medications, and I should think twice quickly because we don't really know what happens when people are on multiple meds. I think out of expediency, they move to say that it's related to the underlying condition, and because there's guidelines saying, just then this drug and then this drug, and then now we're going to add this one, that it's just easier. It's an easier way to process people through a system until they break. And I think there's a blindness to it that is really, the problem with psychiatry is there's hardly any emphasis on side effects in training. I mean, we've got a DSM out there. It's a 1,000-page book. There's like 10 pages in there on side effects. Most doctors I've spoken to, they don't even know how to find the most up-to-date FDA labels. They learn everything from their superiors, who also, tend to be, also haven't really been educated that well on side effects. And so I feel like they simply lack the training and the knowledge to pick up on these things because we don't emphasize it as a profession. And then you have things like what you see in the jails where these prescribing cascades and people probably getting nuked with meds until they develop NMS, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, and other serious, potentially fatal and life-threatening complications of these meds.
Nuked with meds is a great phrase.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you define neuroleptic malignant syndrome?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a serious adverse reaction that happens on very high doses of antipsychotic, and people become feverish. It essentially is, it destabilizes the core elements of their nervous system, which kind of control things like temperature, heart rate, and so people become very confused. They become feverish. They have high blood pressure. Sometimes they have seizures, and it's a fatal condition. It's like serotonin syndrome, which is the same problem, but with the serotonergic antidepressants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What are some of the other most common or most serious, perhaps you could answer both, what are the most common adverse effects? And I know that we might have to take the different classes of drugs one by one, but maybe generally speaking, what are some of the most common adverse effects that you see, and what are also some of the most extreme?
So the most common adverse effects, I would actually say, are the direct effects of the drug. So so if we were to look at antidepressants for the most part, that they can be kind of blunting, that people are restricted in their full range of emotions. They have difficulty crying, and sometimes people can even become callous or a little bit disconnected from the emotions of those around them. They can have those types of emotional problems. There's also the sexual side effects with the antidepressants. With the antipsychotics, in many ways, it's very similar to the antidepressants. They become kind of blunted and disconnected. And I think with benzodiazepines, things like Xanax and Klonopin, people actually gradually, the most common thing I see is it makes people emotionally labile and more anxious. They start to have mood swings. They start to become more irritable slowly over time. As for the more rare and serious things, I usually think about the permanent problems. And so protracted withdrawal injury. So when people try and come off the antidepressants and the benzodiazepines, a small fraction of them will develop enduring neurological problems. A small fraction of people coming off antidepressants develop persistent sexual dysfunction. And those, in my opinion, are the most serious problems that are happening to people on these medications.
And that's a very interesting answer too, that what you said in the first half of your answer, that the most common adverse effects are essentially the intended effects of the drug, are the direct effects that the drug is designed to create. That's an interesting point, that essentially the effect that the drug is intended to induce is adverse. And people who begin taking it often don't realize that. And this is a point that I know people, listeners of this podcast have heard me make before, but perhaps it's worth mentioning again that, when you study the history of psychiatry, every treatment that we now look back upon as just insane was described as being effective. And that includes frontal lobotomies, as well as organ removal, as well as high pressure shower therapy, and all of these things that we look back upon and think, who was the insane person there? And when we say things like drugs are safe and effective, or that they work, the super important question is always, what exactly does work mean? Or what exactly are the effects when we say effective? Because the effects have never been that this person is flourishing, that they're emotionally stable, that cognitively they're sharp, that ultimately they're happy and have high levels of well-being and life satisfaction. That has never been the effects that we're talking about here. The effects, of course, are always just a reduction of symptoms, but it's not that the person's well-being has been promoted in any way.
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point. Again, I think, what's buried when people hear safe and effective, they go, oh, it's going to work for my depression. And maybe they assume that I'm going to be better in my relationships. I'm going to have more drive. I'm going to succeed, in my career. And this depression, it's this underlying problem, just like diabetes. And this is the drug that's going to correct the chemical imbalance. But no, these are blunting agents, like you said. And we say effective because they bring down symptoms of anxiety and depression on a rating scale. Believe me, if they were ever able to find consistently that these antidepressants improved job performance or relationships or these other quality of life measures, I mean, they would be shoving it in our face, and they don't, at least not consistently that I've seen. And so yeah, you can reduce symptoms of anxiety, but sometimes that anxiety might be good. That anxiety may be, or there can be collateral damage to muting anxiety, such that you're not as attuned to your partner and your relationship goes down the toilet, or you ignore you no longer see signs from your children that they're struggling and that they need closer attention to truly understand what's going on with them. You might miss that. You may miss things at work. See people become callous.
Yeah.
And so there are collateral effects out there which doctors don't monitor for when we kind of blunt people in a way that it makes them feel more comfortable, but at the same time, it's making them less effective in other areas of their life.
Exactly. I think, I've heard many, many experts, Robert Whitaker being one of them, and many others kind of use the analogy of alcohol, and if you think about the effects of alcohol, let's say someone is inhibited in social situations, they can't quite become chatty, they can't quite dance or be expressive in any way, and then they take a couple of shots of tequila and they're like, oh wow, I feel way better now. The way that we talk about psychiatric drugs is equivalent to as if we were to say in that situation that this person had this chemical imbalance that alcohol corrected in their brain, and now their inhibitions are released because their brain has been balanced out by this drug that we call alcohol.
Yeah. That's crazy. And I think that's psychiatry's dirty secret, if I was going to say, because every time you ask establishment psychiatrist or someone, what do these drugs do? They'll tell you, antidepressants, we don't really know exactly what they do. For a long time, we thought that they regulated our neurotransmitters. Now we think they may stimulate BDNF, its brain-derived neurotrophic factor. They always try and talk about it as if there is a biological issue that is being corrected. And I feel like it's to distract away from the uncomfortable truth that these are drugs, just like any other drugs, and that they have a drug effect, and that can, and while it is fairly constant in most people, it can be unpredictable. It can make people suicidal when they have paradoxical responses. It can make them violent. It can have effects on wide areas of your functioning, and they need to be highly monitored. Because if that got out, that's actually what these drugs are doing, family doctors would not be prescribing that. They would only be used by people who, like psychiatrists, who were really spending a lot of time with their patients to understand all the areas that this drugging was affecting in their life, so that they could be used in a way that might be beneficial. They don't want to do that. They want to talk about it like it's diabetes. And I think there's a really clear reason for that, because it makes it a lot easier to prescribe and monitor when you think about it as, fixing this mysterious chronic mental illness in a biological way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Kind of on this note, when we think of, regular drugs, be they legal or illegal, when we think of drugs like alcohol or cocaine or something like that, no one in their right mind would ever say, I need alcohol, or alcohol saves my life, or I need cocaine. We wouldn't take anybody seriously if they said that. But many people do say, I need my Klonopin, I need my Xanax, I need my psychiatric drugs. And I've even seen, I've looked at many of your tweets and some of the comments that come. I wanted to kind of get a sense of what you're dealing with in terms of like pushback and things like that. And indeed, I saw in many cases people say, like, pushing back on, I think in one of your tweets, you said something to the effect of, in some cases, doing nothing may have been better than the drug prescription. And then I saw a response to that, which was a person who was very offended and stated that the drugs saved their life. So this is common, that the drugs saved their life and that they need to be on these drugs. And I think many people, I find it's often especially common with people dealing with bipolar disorder, that not only them, but their family especially has this belief that they absolutely need to be on this drug, and that the thought of coming off of it is just irrational. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this widespread belief that some people literally need to be on these drugs?
I'm going to give a complicated answer for that because I think about this carefully, and I mean, the first thing that I want to say is I get it. Like, I mean, if you've gone off these meds before and you became manic and you ended up in the hospital and you just lost 6 months of your life with instability, you wouldn't want to do that again. You might have nearly killed yourself. You might have financially ruined yourself. That it's so traumatic, and I get that you would just be like, okay, I'm just going to stay on. So I empathize with that. The other thing that I think about is that this is a complicated issue, and I think about what these drugs do long term, and I think that there are variations of what they can do. So most drugs lead to tolerance over time through a process called homeostasis. Our body pushes against them, and actually, let me take a step back. The step back from this is it possible that these drugs are actually helpful for some people? And I think it definitely is. You can get on an antidepressant, and let's say your baseline, for whatever reason, is highly anxious to the point that you're crippled and you can't do anything because of the anxiety, and you get on a drug, and that drug turns it down a level and your level of functioning improves. Did that drug help that person? Sure. That's great. And that's a wonderful thing. But what happens long term? And here's where I think, okay, that there could be possibilities. You can have a partial adaptation to it. So, the homeostatic mechanisms kind of kick in, and it sort of, you just find a nice balance. And for whatever reason, you're sort of lucky, and that drug effect is stable for you for several years or even decades. And you enjoy that effect of that drug, and it's just helping you. And I think that's a fine thing. And if you were to say to me, I really need this drug to function, and it's just working for me, and it's great, that's okay. But you also have to hold the fact that there's a lot of people out there where the drug effect completely goes away, and they just need higher and higher doses. I don't know why some people completely become tolerant to the drug, and they need higher and higher doses, or gradually over time, some people become paradoxical to them and the drugs start to harm them. And that's the scary thing about psychiatric meds is, I'd work with a lot of people, and these drugs worked for, years to decades, and it just turned on them. And so having to take long-term psychiatric drugs is kind of scary because, at least from my perspective, I don't know when, is it going to stop working eventually? Are they going to have problems? So when I hear these comments, I mean, I don't know what's going on with that individual person, but I still try and hold space for the fact that, is it possible that a drug effect could have a beneficial impact on someone's life? And, they have ruled out all other problems, and they're not over adapting to it, and it's just working for them. Yeah, I think that's possible. And I think that's a great thing for that person if it's working for them. But it still doesn't get rid of the problem, which is we don't even know who those people are, and we put a lot of people on them, and we sell them certainty and that it's going to be a great thing long term, and a lot of people get harmed. I don't know if that was helpful. That's kind of how I kind of think about those issues.
I think that's a very sound answer. And I mean, I agree. And I often find myself saying, especially when I'm talking about these issues, maybe like in a lecture hall or something like that, I find myself really clarifying, I'm not generally against chemical support. I think that there's a place for chemical support. But I just think it's very important to emphasize that when we're talking about that case you described of a person for whom it's really indeed helping, like it's curbing their anxiety just enough to where they can function better. I think, you're right, that there are definitely cases like that. And I just think that the right way to frame it is in the same way that we would talk about a person who's able to drink a couple glasses of wine 3 or 4 nights a week and really be benefited by that, really like relax and chill and just stop worrying so much, that type of thing. So I think as long as, in my opinion, we are framing that as just like alcohol or cannabis or other substances, then that's kind of the right way to think of it. And indeed, cannabis and alcohol can be extremely helpful for people, and many people are able to keep it in moderation and not let tolerance grow too strong and not let it get out of control. And it's just a net positive effect in their life. So I'm with you. I think that's a very sound answer. And I think if people are just framing it the right way, which is not that this is like correcting a chemical imbalance in my brain, but rather that this is inducing a pharmacological effect that I find to be very helpful, then that's the right approach.
And if you're listening without the video, I'm kind of nodding along to what Nick is saying now, and I just want to add something. One of the biggest problems that I have is we don't really give people informed consent, because I think a lot of the times, like that situation that I described would be okay if you did things correctly. So someone comes in with depression, you actually spend the time to get to know them. You actually go, okay, well, tell me about your relationships, tell me about your work, let me understand your life. Because ideally, the solution is that you try non-drug treatments first, because that's going to be much safer than getting someone kind of hooked on a drug long-term that you can't predict what it's going to do, a couple of years down the line. You simply cannot. And so we often don't do that at all. People come in and we say you've got depression or bipolar, so we just put them on a drug straight away without even running the appropriate protocols to do everything to divert using this drug that's potentially going to be unpredictable in the long term. And that's, that's a disaster. And this one case where I bring up where it's just like, if there was a person and they ran all those things and they tried to fix it in every other way that they could, and the system was working correctly, and then, they did end up on a drug and it helped them, that's great. But the fraction of people that I meet where that was actually their story is like zero, because I don't really see most people, at least in traditional mental health settings, getting, finding doctors who are really trying to help them with non-drug therapies that might actually get to the root cause of their problems. Because most of mental health, I think, it's understandable in the context of people's lives. It's very rare to find someone that I just go, this doesn't make sense at all.
Right. That's a great point. And I think in those cases, most likely that's when there actually is a biological cause in place. And I think that is like, although everything I just said about sometimes these drugs, if you think of them like cannabis or alcohol, can have a place in a person's life, like I do stand behind what I said, but I also acknowledge that I don't think that drinking wine 3 or 4 times a week or every single night is the ideal thing for a person to do. And I wouldn't judge it, and I understand it. But if there is anxiety or depression, then there's a cause to it. And it's crucial to understand that cause. And sometimes, like, in psychology, we often think of the 3 big buckets of contributing factors to anyone's behavior or emotional states. And those are the psychological, the biological, and the environmental, which are all intertwined, but also distinct. And sometimes there are psychological issues like unresolved trauma, for example, or maladaptive belief systems. And then there are environmental causes like, sick societies and abusive households and bullying at school and things like that. And if the cause is in one of those buckets, the solution needs to come from that same bucket, and so I think that is the danger when we have people who are not being harmed by the drugs, and so they continue taking them, whether we're talking about alcohol or prescribed drugs. But ultimately, like you're saying, the underlying issue is never exposed or addressed, and that's what really needs to happen. Like I think of one of my sort of versions of a dystopian world is a world where everyone is walking around almost drunkenly happy while the world is burning and everything is horrible and the environment is deteriorating and everything's ugly and there's no art and there's no human connection, but everyone's on some type of drug that's inducing this state of euphoria. that would be a worse dystopia than everyone being miserable while the world is burning, because if everyone's miserable, that's an appropriate reaction.
Yeah, I mean, there's the whole line of I swear I've read this somewhere, or maybe it's just me thinking to myself, but it's sometimes it doesn't really feel like we're that far from where we are. And if you wanted to be like, put your tinfoil hat on, and I mean, you could make some decent cases that in some ways psychiatry is kind of pushing us there, because it's a lot easier to say, well, this person has a major depressive disorder than, oh, actually, like, our state and our society is sick, and the way we treat people is not good. And, the way we've structured our work and our families and all of these things, which is kind of going around business and the strong capitalist culture here, which has its benefits, but also has tremendous harms. Sometimes it's a lot easier to say that all the mental illness is on the rise, rather than kind of, look at these other things. And
Exactly. Well, I want to talk to you about like what kind of response you've gotten from the world online and in person. I'm sure you've kind of heard more like vitriolic responses online, as it tends to go. But so since you've made this change and you've started your own private practice and you have the taper clinic and you've been outspoken about all of these issues, what has been some of the, pushback and maybe insulting responses that you've received? And then also have you also received support?
So both of those things. I have a lot of people cheering me on and sending me really kind messages from around the world, and that's lovely. Interestingly, I have psychiatric colleagues who I went to school with reaching out to me in private and saying, "Hey, I really like some of the stuff that you're doing." Most of the vitriol comes from just people on Twitter. Honestly, that seems to be where people hang out, and they're really opinionated. But you get all sorts of things when you tread into the public domain. I feel like some people, even within our drug withdrawal community, they want their hero to look a certain way. I'm not trying to say I'm a hero, but I get feedback where it's just like, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you should kind of say things in this way. And honestly, it's I try and not get into it and bring myself back to my center. It's like, I'm me, I have my message, and I'm going to try and deliver it in an authentic way. I may not be the voice that everyone wants to hear in this space, but it's just my voice. And I guess the main thing is I have my wife, who's also a psychiatrist, whom I trust most. Okay. And as long as she tells me, like, hey, this is okay, you're going in the right direction, I take a lot of solace in that. And, I've got some colleagues I trust a lot. And so I've got some people I just check in with who I respect a lot. And they're just like, yeah, it's good, heading in the right direction. And mostly I try and, just try to stay away from some of the criticism, because as much as you try and ignore it, what's that expression, kind of lives rent free in your head. It takes up RAM in the processor. And so being online is crazy. I don't know how people become like movie stars when they're teenagers or in their early 20s.
Oh, right.
That stuff that would be crazy. I have a fraction of that, and stresses me out. I can't imagine what it's like to be in the limelight like that at such a young age. Yeah.
Same. And honestly, it's funny. I know I'm aware of myself that I'm actually quite sensitive.
Is it?
Comments that come on YouTube videos or wherever else, they affect me. I'm sensitive, and I think I'm becoming a bit hardened the longer I have an online presence. But yeah, people forget that there's a human on the other end of their comment who's reading it and who feels emotions.
Yeah, I guess the price you pay to be online,
Right. Yeah. I didn't know you had a wife who's also a psychiatrist. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, she's probably the reason that I was able to keep on going because,
All
you
right.
know, there was someone who was there who was just like, no, you're right. The stuff that you're saying is real. And yeah, she's awesome. She's,
How long you been together?
we met in December of 2014, actually
All right.
interviewing for the same residency position. So
Oh,
we
wow.
turned up at the same interview together, and we were reading the same book. We were the first two people there, and we just hit it off. And that
Wow.
was it. Yeah.
And so did you and her kind of, you know, did your thinking evolve in lockstep with each other, or was one of you kind of ahead of the other in terms of getting to this place?
I was definitely at least more bothered by what was going on. I'd say my wife is, my wife is like, she's just like a winner. I don't know how to say. It's like she gets corporate politics. She understands how to like, you know, do really well with people. She's very sensitive, emotionally attuned in that way. And so she, me, and so, but she's also really, really switched on. And so when I was having all these problems, I would talk to her about it, and she'd be like, yeah, you're right, but you can't say this right now because you have to get through your training. You got to do it in this way and that way. And so she was, you know, very supportive, but also very practical and just kind of guiding me through the whole thing until I could be more independent. But all the stuff that I was saying to her, she was just like, yeah, I think you're onto something. And we're like identical pretty much in the way we see things. Yeah.
And it sounds like she's almost been a PR person for you a little bit, and it's important to be strategic, I think, in a position like yours, or when, like anyone who's speaking out about these issues. Frankly, you have to have a degree of status for people to take you seriously. Like the fact that you say all this while wearing a white coat that says MD on it, it just makes everything you say hold a lot more weight in people's perception, which honestly, if we're being real, is a bit of a logical fallacy. Like it's an appeal to authority. Your white coat doesn't actually make anything you're saying make more sense. But the reality is, in people's perception, status matters and authority matters. And then in a real sense too, like you are based in, you're steeped in knowledge about your field and about everything that you're talking about. So I'm not implying that the white coat is like meaningless at all. I'm just saying
it's interesting because it is something I ruminate on things as well. And I see the irony, you know, because I'm knocking doctors and the followers of the white coat frequently. Yeah, you know, every time I read marketing books, they say things just like, there's just these knee-jerk reactions people say, and people have, and sometimes when they see a white coat, they go, "Oh, doctor," you know, and even though I'm someone who believes that you shouldn't follow the white coat and all of that, we still use it because, gosh, the videos perform better when I wear it. There's more views.
So funny.
There's because I've done this with my social media guys. It's just like, Josef, wear the white coat. You know, the retention is better. Is that crazy?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's like, we understand, like we get it. People's perception. People want to see status. They want to see authority, and this is a symbol of status.
Just diplomas behind me. It's like,
right.
There's just these. It's these things. I mean, you can knock it all, but at the end of the day, it's in the zeitgeist. It's in the culture. It's what makes people go, well, hang on a second. I'm going to stick around 10 seconds longer just to hear what the white coat has to say. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I say continue to leverage it because it's effective.
Yeah.
Maybe, I know we're about at an hour here, but as a kind of final little chapter, you know, we don't have time. It's not the appropriate place for you to literally explain the science of tapering, but maybe you can help us understand some of the basic principles of tapering, and then maybe make a recommendation for anyone who's listening who is considering tapering off of their psychiatric drug.
Yeah. So the basic, the kind of 1 minute version of it is tapering has to be done in response to signals from your body. And so there's no real timeline on tapering. The goal is to remove the drug without having severe withdrawal symptoms. And the safest way to do that in general is to make 5 to 10% reductions every 30 or so days, and to slow it down if you ever have severe withdrawal. This may take, if you've been on the drug for several years, this might take 1 to 2 years to do. And the goal is really that you come off without substantial withdrawal symptoms, because there is something about the withdrawal symptoms that actually can be toxic. It can put you at risk of a condition called protracted withdrawal. And although I think it's uncommon that that's going to happen, my practice is filled with people who are having that problem, and it's a serious one. And so go slow, listen to your body. If you want to know more about this, my YouTube channel is the place to go. It's Dr. Josef. That's the German spelling. So Dr.Josef, not PH. And we have a playlist called Tapering Tips, and it's essentially a collection of best practices in tapering. It's all, just in videos and edited. And that may be a good place to get a more in-depth understanding of how to do drug tapering.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I hope this is not the last conversation we'll ever have. I hope we can stay in touch, and just thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing the work that you do.
Nick, it was a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed having this discussion with you.
Likewise. And to our audience members who are watching and or listening, thank you for, being here. I'm glad the whole conversation kept your attention. And yeah, I wish everyone clarity in all of their decision making around these issues.